Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Humanities Cafe. My name is Stacy Chidowsha. I am the program coordinator here at the South Dakota Humanities Council, and I am excited that you're all joining us today. Today, we're going to talk about something that's kind of been fascinating to me for a long time. And kind of as an introduction, American Indians make up about 2% of the US population, but images of Indians are everywhere, right? So from imagery on various products and team mascots to classic Western movies, episodes of Seinfeld and South Park, we're surrounded by Native American imagery. In reality, American Indians have been part of the nation's identity since before the country began. So how is it that Indians can be so present and yet so absent in American life? And what role do mascots, stereotypes, and cultural appropriation have in perpetuating this everywhere yet nowhere phenomenon? Joining us today to help unpack this issue are two amazing scholars who could speak to the heart of this issue, Dr. John Little and Megan Redshirt Shaw. Megan, I'm going to have you introduce yourselves a little bit. So tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Michajiki Megan Redshirt Shaw, Lakol Michajiki Chanko Ashtawi, Waziahanaha Himataha Malakota. Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Redshirt Shaw. I see a lot of people that I love very much in this room, so I'm excited that you've joined the conversation today. I am currently the Director of Native Student Services at the University of South Dakota, and I am also a doctoral candidate at the University of Minnesota in Organizational Leadership, Policy, and Development with a focus in higher education and a minor in American Indian Studies. I'm an enrolled member of the Oglala Sioux Tribe. My grandfather is also Sichonghu from Rosebud, and I grew up all over the United States in higher education spaces. So I literally, from the time I was born, have always been on a college campus and decided to pursue a pathway where I continued to be on college campuses in my career. I attended the University of Pennsylvania as an undergraduate. I studied creative writing, an English major, which I loved and I'm still very passionate about. And then I did my master's at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in higher education, hopeful to work with Native students and communities and pursuing post-secondary education. And then in my doctoral work have focused on Native student success and a living learning community program that we have here at the University of South Dakota, which was started in 2021 called Wiyushkiant BTP, Living Learning Community. I am the daughter of Dr. Delphine Redshirt and Dean Richard Shaw, and very happily married to Dr. Little, who is also on this call. So that's a little bit about me. Very passionate about animal rescue, sustainable fashion, and just doing as much as I can to empower Native people and Native voices. So I will turn it over to Dr. Little.
What Megan also forgot to say is that she's actually graduating next week with her PhD. So starting next week, she will be Dr. Redshirt Shaw as well too. So I'm gonna introduce myself. So Hamidak Yapi, Chante Washtena Pe Chizapero, Ishkawan Chiankapi, John and Makapido, Damakota, Homashichu, Mihunka Ke King, Kenneth Ka Catherine and Wichak Yapi, Miate Yambos Date Tahan. So hello, my relatives. I just greeted you in Dakota and I said, I shake your hand today with a good heart. I'm really excited to be here and I'm excited to have a conversation for South Dakota Humanities, but also with Megan as well too. So my name is John Little. I'm currently the Director of Native Recruitment and Alumni Engagement at the University of South Dakota. And so a lot of my role focuses on helping Native students transition to campus and kind of get through their first year of programming or the first year of schooling at the University of South Dakota. But then I also work with our alumni. We have about 1,500 Native alumni that have graduated through the University of South Dakota. So doing different programming like that for them as well. And then currently, my background in education, I guess, is I attended the University of South Dakota for my master's, South Dakota State for my undergrad, and then the University of Minnesota for my PhD. I also am the co-director alongside my brother of a film called More Than a Word, which focuses on kind of analyzing and looking at mascots of particularly the Washington football team. And so kind of looking at just the history of Native mascots and cultural appropriation in the United States. And so just really excited to be here. I see my mom is here as well too, so that's always nice. So shout out to my mom. And I see a lot of other folks, like Megan said too, that I work with, but also have kind of gotten to meet along this journey. And so just grateful for all of you to be here today.
Well, thank you both so much. Congratulations, Megan. We're honored and thrilled to have you both here to unpack this issue that's got a lot of moving parts. But basically, to start it off, when the whole title of the program, Everywhere and Nowhere, um, in a nutshell, Native American images, symbols, stories are everywhere, right? They're ubiquitous to central to American identity. It's that piece is in itself is unique, but coupled with that is the reality that actual Indians are largely invisible, right? I spent the last few days in Washington D.C. At the National Museum of the American Indian, and I had the honor and the privilege to have some conversations with Paul Chott Smith, who's the curator of the exhibition there, and his comment was to me. He said that American Indians are the special sauce that makes the U.S. the U.S. And I thought he hit it right on the head. So historically, what's up with that piece? I mean, Native Americans have been here thousands of years, and this the imagery and pieces of reality like that is part of American life back over 300 years. John, I know that you are well acquainted with Philip Deloria and his book Playing Indian. He talks about how this goes back to the Boston Tea Party. So throughout history, like going back a little bit, how did this? What is the reality of the everywhere and nowhere piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. That's always something when I was traveling for the film with my brother or without my brother, I guess, as well, depending on where we were at. That was something we were usually challenging people that were attending the film to kind of go out and like start looking around wherever you go, whether you go to the grocery store or the mall or wherever, and start kind of thinking about and noticing all the imagery you see with that. And it's kind of eye-opening for them because people don't really think about that when they're going anywhere. But all of a sudden you go to the store and you start noticing at the time, you know, the Land O'Lakes, like the Indian Maiden on there, right? Or maybe if you're in the DC area and you're going and you're seeing a bag of Fritos, which has like the Washington football team logo on it, right? Because they had a partnership with like Lay's and all those. And so it's one of those things that it is really easy for folks to kind of overlook and not think about because it's just like so ingrained. But it's always that kind of stereotypical like Indian plains, like on a horse, like headdress type of image that a lot of people imagine too. And I think so. It is one of those things like that's something that I point out to a lot of students because once you start thinking about that, it's hard to unsee. You start noticing it everywhere. You start noticing it all of a sudden when you're walking to class and you see like the Sioux, like a lot of um the like sewer system stuff is like a company called like Sioux Industry or something like that, right? And you start seeing all of these things when you go everywhere. And so that's something that I point out to a lot of students as well too. But kind of going back to kind of your other question too, and with Phil's work, I really encourage people to read Phil Deloria's work. Dr. Phil Deloria, he's currently a history professor. He's Dakota at Harvard University right now. But he does a really good job of unpacking a lot of that narrative of like why that has been around in his book called Playing Indian. And essentially, kind of the argument for that is that essentially, when colonizers or colonists, I guess, were coming over here, they were trying to separate themselves from like previous folks from coming over here. And so, one of the reasons that they did that was kind of recreate themselves as Native people, right? So, there's like that's the story that you probably all grew up hearing was that a bunch of white folks dressed up as Indians and then threw tea into the ocean, right? That's like one of that classic narrative. And one of the reasons that they did that was to kind of separate themselves again, is like create themselves as like new kind of indigenous folks in the United States and kind of start over from there. And so that's kind of why you see a lot of that imagery really develop, especially in the early 1900s. You see it kind of coming. We see the creation of all these like native mascots and all the football teams kind of coming in around the 1920s. And so that's a really amazing book if you're interested in learning more about the specific history of a lot of like that and kind of where all that pops up. Phil goes through and kind of traces that whole history for that as well too. But I can pass it over to Megan if Megan has any other thing to add too.
I was just thinking about, the scene in your film, where you and Ken were interviewing people in the parking lot, right? About dressing up. And I think that even in the things that I reflect on a lot in the work that we get to do every day, which is John and I work with fantastic Native students and Native people every day. It's a privilege and an honor. And I think that even in being in that role, I grew up in predominantly spaces where I was the only Native student in all my classrooms, basically, up until about 11th grade when I moved to Arizona. And one of the things that I was just thinking about when you were talking about Phil and talking about playing Indian is when I leave South Dakota, I have to reorient myself to remember that in other places, like this is just not part of the consciousness of American people. And it's been healing a lot of ways in my work as an educator to be in a space where now I'm surrounded by Native people all the time, and that's the norm. But it oftentimes reminds me of in my almost K through 12 classrooms, right, where the majority of students that I was around growing up did not understand that Native people continued to exist and persist. So again, just to echo John, playing Indian is a powerful testament to what much of the American consciousness focuses on when they think about Native people.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that viewpoint, because I think that's important to point out. And it kind of fits along with what we're saying. You were the only Native student in your class, and yet how many images of Native American imagery? How much of that was just everywhere, and yet you were the only one in your class. So that moves us up to today, and mentioning John and Ken's film More Than a Word, which I've seen a number of times now because it's excellent. Um, Tell us about that experience and what you found, and like the parking lot scene is excellent. But what else? What other kind of things? What surprised you, and what really didn't surprise you at all?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think we've already kind of touched base on like I think for me, the most like surprising thing was seeing like the amount of people that just had like no idea. And there's a lot of like clips that didn't make it into the film too. So like Megan was saying, when we're interviewing all these like fans at tailgating, right? And so we're going through it, and we interviewed them both at a Kansas City game and also at a Washington game. And these folks are just saying these like interesting, like ridiculous things about Native people because they've never met any Native people, right? And they had, my brother and I are both like, don't hit the perception of what they think Native people should look like, right? Because I'm not wearing a head like on a horse and like a headdress or something along those lines. And so they had no idea that they were talking to like Native people as they're saying those things. And I think there's this really surprising moment for me. Again, we're at tailgating, so I'm interviewing folks at like 8 or 9 a.m. and they're talking about how like the things that they do know about Native people is a lot of stereotypes right there. So there's one individual saying like, well, a lot of Native folks, like they're all alcoholics, and this dude's drinking a beer at 9 a.m. On a Sunday, right? And so it was like some of those like really like surprising moments of like them what they think they know about Native people, but also like what's okay for them to do, but like not Native people can't do, right? And so those were like really big surprising moments too. And so I think the other thing is there's just so many layers to it. That was one of the reasons that we decided to call it More Than a Word, was because you can start kind of going down one level of it and like think you're understanding it, but then also like not understanding it as well too. So I think yeah, so I think that's kind of what like one of the biggest surprises things was just like how little like people interacted with Native people when they were doing that as well too.
Yeah, thank you. And I put a link to the film, a couple links in the chat for you to check it out. The first one is where you can go view it for free, and then the other one, if you want to, if you're like me and you want to see it all the time, and you don't have the DVD, it's available also at the Vimeo account. So, and it's funny because that's this when I think about it brings me around to what you had alluded to in the beginning here. There are what 574 federally recognized tribes and more than 100 state recognized tribes, and then some that aren't recognized at all. So, and yet we still have that one image. It's like you said, it's either the warrior on horseback, or the headdress, or the Indian maiden, or the Disney princess. So let's break this down a little bit. In a nutshell, what is a stereotype?
Do you want to do that one, Megan, or do you want me to? Yeah, I mean, this is like a tricky question, but a stereotype is kind of a lot of perceptions of just like a lot of things kind of put into one little idea about what someone is or isn't. And so for like us, a lot of stereotypes that are like native people are like stoic, they never laugh, or we're dead, right? Because like
Yeah.
historically we're perceived as to be in the past. Again, there's a lot of perception that we're all alcoholics. And so those are kind of like stereotypes that are just like a little bit, a bunch of things kind of crammed into like one idea that represent like a bunch of different people, right? And so it could be native people, it could be a lot of different communities, right? Have stereotypes about them as well too.
So when we talk about it, we'll look at it in a socio-political type of historical context. This is something that I noticed when I was at the NMAI the last few days. There's actually a display there where Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence referred to um, the Native peoples as merciless Indian savages. So that's the first big, okay, this is what Native American people are. Um, and the whole manifest destiny, of 19th century. We call it now American exceptionalism, which is just an ethnocentric way of saying, you know, basically there's just one viewpoint and that's the right one, and that's just how we're going to operate. So after the Little Bighorn, so we have this the merciless Indian savage, and then the Battle of Little Bighorn came along where Custer was defeated, and that just was like, oh, up the Indian Wars and stuff, these savages, savages, savages. And then after Custer's defeat, Sitting Bull went on a tour, and he was, then everybody wanted to be like he was. It was pretty amazing. He's pretty cool. These Indians are pretty fascinating. We kind of like them. Um, so that we have that then not as necessary the merciless savages. Then it was the noble savages, and moving forward then from even into what now the water protectors are seen as teary-eyed environmentalists, or like you referred to, John. A lot of people say they're just drunk and living off the government. Those types of pernicious stereotypes that still exist out there. Or there's the casino rich. The other thing is all Native Americans are rich because of casinos. But I think underlying all of that is what you referred to when you were meeting with people, is that the whole narrative of the vanishing red man, that real Indians don't exist anymore, right? They're all just relegated to history. So and it's funny because I have a book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and Dina Gilio Whitaker. It's called All the Real Indians Died Off and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans, and she hits it on the head. There's so many stereotypes in there. So what are some of the other like stereotypes that you think are most pervasive, not only most pervasive, but most harmful?
I think rather than focusing on the negative stereotypes, right, I think it's important to focus on the systems that have impacted us to this point,
Okay.
right? So I think rather than like reiterating kind of the negative things that people say about Native people, I think thinking about the historical framework that has sort of pushed us forward, right, to have these stereotypes. I oftentimes now, I think in my own work, I'm just startled that people continue to believe those things, because that's not what I get to see in my day to day. I see scholars, I see future doctors, I see lawyers, I see people that are pursuing their future and to make their futures better. And so I think, unfortunately, we've been a community of people where those historical frameworks have been a disservice to us, because we're not given an opportunity to be in history books in a realistic way. We're not given an opportunity for things to be land specific, community specific, language specific. Our communities are so rich, they're so full of powerful opportunities for growth. So even hearing all of those stereotypes listed made me feel sick, right? Because it's hard and it's harmful for Native people to continue to know that there are people that believe those things about us, when so many of us have an opportunity to see the completely sort of flip side of that, right? One of the things that I thought about, John and I will often tell this story about, we were traveling in the Northeast, and we were in a cab going to the airport. And in the cab ride, the cab driver, was talking to us about what we were doing. We had been in an all Native program. And he, was like, oh, are you Native? And where are you from? And all of this stuff. And at the end of the cat, he got very passionate about Native people, and he started saying, well, you are the most respected community of people in the United States. You are the most revered, you're the most respected. And John and I, we had a friend with us, and we were kind of like, interesting that, that this person really believes that. And then we went into the airport in that particular community, and they rejected our tribal IDs, and we weren't allowed to use our tribal identification to go through TSA. So it was this really interesting like juxtaposition of this person who was like, you're so revered, and then in our own sovereignty, right? In our own ability to like identify ourselves as Native people walking through an airport, right? Like this, it was just such a crazy stark juxtaposition. So, I think that yes, there are so many harmful stereotypes about Native people, but I think rather than like focusing on what those are, how do we reframework a future where our young people, in 50 years from now, those stereotypes are things of the past, right? That's what we've really invested our work in. John's film, all of the work that him and Ken have done, and the work that we get to do day to day with young Native people, and empowerment frameworks, and really sort of focusing what stereotypes look like for Native people too.
I think I might go off that a little bit too. And actually, that was a really funny moment because our friend got through security. We had to stand there for 20 minutes and wait. And our friend got through security, and as he's through security, he texted us and said, "Most respected people," in quotes back to us. And so yeah, it was a funny moment in which it was a really interesting moment. But I think the other flip side of that too is important. The reason for stereotypes, there's usually reasons for that, right? And so a lot of the reasons that we have these stereotypes or imagery of Native people kind of in the past is because then it becomes easy to forget about us in the present. These are strategies, right? Because if Native people died off and are extinct, then their land that they had access to or that they were using is free, right? Quote unquote free. And so if you remove those restrictions, then essentially like that was a tactic back in the day to like get access to land and to take land. And so and that's part of the justification for like all of colonialism, right? Is all Native people are savages and they don't know how to use the land. They're not using it correctly. So like we should be the ones to have that. And so I think that's also like an important thing of factoring that to in that, if you're like going against, and then on the flip side of it, thinking about like a team like the Washington football team, they're claiming they're honoring and respecting all of these Native people and doing all of these things that are supporting them, but at the same time they're not supporting Native communities, right? And so that's kind of where a lot of that problem comes in. And so I think it's just important to think if there's a stereotype about a community, whether it's Native or any community, it's important to ask why that stereotype exists, because there's usually a reason for that. And it's usually to dehumanize people, right? Or to make them less human. And so I think that's an important part to like factor into like a lot of those stereotypes as well too.
Oh, there's a question in the chat for Dr. Little. I have never thought of that as a strategy. Makes total sense. And absolutely, I'm glad you brought that out, John, because it is the other. It's easy to downplay the other if they don't exist. So, and you brought up the mascot. I want to get back to the mascot piece because I was kind of there's the argument about honoring the warriors in Native culture. And another thing that Paul Chott Smith mentioned was providing a way to introduce Native culture. I'm not sure that a mascot is the way you want to introduce Native culture to people in a broader sense, but I was in my meeting in Washington. I was actually joined by a scholar from Florida State University, which is the Seminoles. And so we talked about that a little bit, and they do have a relationship with the Seminole tribe. But it's interesting that for people who don't know, it's the mascot, especially at the college and professional level, the mascot piece has been very contentious. But what have you learned and experienced with that, your journey in making the film, John, and why are people so staunchly wanting to hold on to these mascots?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like a really interesting question. I think the interesting part, so when we're making the film, it's coming out, we're working on it 2015, 2016, and then it comes out in 2017. And so as we're finishing it, the like no dapple protests are going on in Standing Rock, right? And so it was really interesting to see. And then a couple of years before that, it was interesting to see the University of North Dakota and then also the state of North Dakota took these like extreme efforts to pass like legislation and said as essentially like that wouldn't let them drop the Fighting Sioux team name, right? And like they took all these efforts to say like it's a form of honor, like we have to protect this, we have to keep this, because the NCAA was kind of trying to eliminate a lot of Native themed mascots. And so as that's going on, a couple years later, as like a lot of Native people are standing up for water rights in North Dakota for against DAPL, you see the state of North Dakota completely reverse course, right? And so it was really interesting for us to kind of be going through that and creating the film as we're seeing like one of the world's largest protests going on. As like people like a few years before that, they were fighting for this native mascot. So essentially, I watched the state of North Dakota fight harder for a native mascot than they did for actual native people who were saying, we don't want this. We want to protect our water rights. We want to protect our resources, our tribal communities. And so I think that's like kind of a really good juxtaposition of that, of like seeing what that looks like, right? And on the flip side of it, I think one of the biggest things that you see is it's often the alumni that have the largest attachments to those things, right? They went through and they're like, I was a Fighting Sioux and I'm gonna die a Fighting Sioux, right? And so it's a lot of those alumni that I think are the ones that like want to keep that stuff around too, right? But they're probably not interacting with tribal communities, right? They probably didn't go to the Native Center on the University of North Dakota campus when they were there. And so I think that's kind of an interesting component of that, of thinking a little bit about that as that kind of as you kind of think about that. And so that it's like interesting because you think about timing when you're doing something, when you're making something or creating something, right? And I don't know what the film looks like if like DAPL, like the DAPL protests are not going on at that time too, because like I couldn't unsee that, right? And so I think that's an interesting thing to think about, but the film probably looks very differently right now, right? If I'm making a film, 7, 8 years later for that too.
Well, and for people who aren't aware, in 2005, the NCAA handed down a decision where 19 universities were banned from that had Native American mascots, where they were banned from displaying their names, mascots, or images during postseason play, and they were prohibited from hosting tournaments until they changed those. So the five did retain their, I think it was five, retained their names and imagery after gaining support from their respective tribes. So like the Florida Seminole, the Utah Utes. Um, but for the most part, it's changing. But then you still you have other people with how are is it same with NFL teams and NBA and NHL and Major League Baseball? Is that how they're retaining their names? The ones that haven't changed their names? Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's interesting because it's like it's different by case basis too when you look at that. So the Blackhawks have kind of have some relationships with their tribal community, but if you go down in the deeper thing and you look into that, those communities are kind of split in how they view it. And so there's one kind of native community that supports it in Chicago, and there's another native community that's kind of opposed to it. And so you have to kind of look at each by case basis. And so I think that was a large part in that. And the interesting part, I think, when Ken and I were like making the film, you're thinking you want change, right? When you result in it. And I don't think I actually ever envisioned that they were gonna drop the Washington football team name until like Dan Snyder sold the team, which he's now sold the team regardless. But there was so much pressure because of the murder of George Floyd was a huge factor into that, of like having those conversations and wanting to think about those types of conversations. But um, it was funny to see that in 2020, 3 years after the film came out, and just like I never thought the film would be like, I'm like, oh, it's pretty much irrelevant now, right? Like a lot of these things are changing. The Cleveland Indians dropped their name, and so I had this moment where I'm like, man, like I thought like that would be 20 years down the road, and we'd have to like update the film in like 20 years or something like that. And then to see it change so quickly, and then there's kind of this last few years where we haven't been traveling for the film a lot. It's been kind of out of sight, focusing on different career things and stuff. And now I'm like, oh, the film is like relevant again because I'm seeing like what's going on, and there's like conversations in DC. Like now I would be more surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if they changed it back, right? We're back in like a full circle moment where they're like having conversations, and there's a lot of folks trying to like bring it back and get it. And I thought in 2020, 2021, I was like, that'll never happen again. And now I'm to the point where I'm like, I've come full circle on a lot of those things too, where I'm feeling like I wouldn't be surprised if they brought back the R word, right, for the team name. And so now, and we're seeing like a lot of the local levels like are fighting to kind of keep their team mascots. And so I think it's interesting to see how history ebbs and flows, but how quickly it comes, right? I would have never anticipated in 7 years we'd have a complete, in 3 years we'd have a change, and then 7 years later, like there's an opportunity for it to go back, right? And so I think that's really like the interesting thing, but that also shows like the deep connection that people have to these things. Like they would rather have Native people be mascots than they would actually have to engage and like have like actual conversations with Native folks on that too.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you said that because it seems like it's a change in perspective. Like, well, we're more comfortable with, knowing what we knew before. We don't want to be so uncomfortable that we have to actually acknowledge something that we're not familiar with. Along with the mascot piece, of course, is maybe to me the bigger piece is cultural appropriation, which is it's when from people outside participate a particular culture adopt it and elements of that culture in a way that is inappropriate or objectionable to that culture. It's not authorized by members of the main culture. And maybe the cultural appropriation piece is through like pop culture and advertising. When I was at the exhibit at the National Museum of American Indian, they have over 100 artifacts there of things like I'm sure almost everybody who's like been around for the last 10 years remembers the Land O'Lakes Maiden on the butter carton. The curator who's working on an exhibition for a traveling exhibition piece for the Smithsonian said that she had to go on eBay to find one of those cartons now. And she paid $400 for the empty carton. She goes, I didn't even get the butter. She's like, I just got the empty carton. So even with that not being a thing anymore, with that being their actual advertising anymore, it's the interest is still there. There's such an extensive use of stereotypes, violence, and misappropriation and things everywhere. And so Paul Chott Smith, who is the curator at the National Museum of American Indian, pointed out a old can of brake fluid. He's like, he goes, why are Native Americans representing brake fluid? And so just all kinds of things. I remember as a kid, I had a Big Chief writing tablet, and there I saw it in the museum, and I thought, that it is really literally everywhere. So, we think about Indian motorcycles, Winnebago trailers, Jeep Cherokee. It's literally everywhere. And if you think about it more and more, Eskimo pies, it's just a name, right? But it isn't. So what are your thoughts on that, Megan? I know that I like the way you think. So tell me what you think about this.
I think about this a lot in the fashion industry because I'm deeply passionate about fashion and clothing and buying from Native designers. And it's been really cool in the last like 10 years to see how that shift has happened. I have really kind of vivid memories of I'm a big fan of Pharrell Williams, who is a music producer, and he did a very controversial cover story where he's in a headdress. And I wrote him a letter, had it published, I think through Huffington Post, about him wearing that headdress and how harmful that was to me as someone who's a consumer of his music and his talent and deeply a deep fan of his fashion and sort of his progressive way of thinking. And I think that that's where those things extend to, right? For those of us that really look up to people that are in music, in fashion, particular brands that we use, right, or that we depend on. A lot of times those spaces and places are thinking about their consumers. Well, they're not thinking about Native people as consumers, right? Because they don't even know that we're in the consciousness of the market to even be appreciating hip hop, right? Or appreciating particular styles or thinking about fashion. And so for me, a lot of times I'm super interested when there's like a controversy. Other people like Gwen Stefani. Gwen Stefani wore a headdress in one of her music videos, right? There are a lot of pop culture icons who have done this. Probably because it's cool, probably because they had a stylist who told them that that was something that they could do, right? That was appropriate. And even what John was talking about earlier, this sort of like Western framework of the Plains culture and headdress and what a headdress symbolizes for many of our communities. I'm really proud to see how much change has happened because there has been a larger influence of, and we see this in the literature space as well. More Native authors are actually making it onto New York Times bestseller lists. They're making it in the front sections of bookstores. In the fashion world, we have so many Native designers that have come out and been able to challenge really large industries like Ralph Lauren, right? Taking on Ralph Lauren, who had a huge controversy of actually taking Native patterns from museum spaces, right? And putting them into their collections without acknowledging Native people. So I think like for all of us that consume, that depend on consumerism, it's powerful when we're able to push back and say, actually, you know, I'm no longer going to buy from you if you continue to appropriate Native people. And I've seen even more of that in the last 10 years, and of young people who just aren't standing for that anymore. I really love this generation because I think they're starting to see a different possibility of the world. And even though many things are very difficult in the political landscape right now, I get to see that hopefulness every day, right? Of like that we're going to become designers. We're going to be the people in business that are creating those marketing strategies. Like we're going to be the people that have positions at those tables to be able to make those decisions. So yeah, there's so many times where I'm just startled again that somebody hosts a Washington football themed like birthday party or wears a headdress in their music video. Like a lot of times I feel like we're past that. We still have work to do, but I still have been very humbled by how far we've come up until this point also.
Thank you for that. And I know when I think about fashion too, I think about how trendy it is at Coachella or music festivals to, you know, to appropriate American Indian garb and it's strange. So and that's a piece of popular culture in society in general. And then there's the whole like more politicized rather piece with the U.S. military. And this is something that I'm bringing up because I found it fascinating that in 1969 it was actually policy to name every U.S. military helicopter after a Native American tribe or chief, or you know, it had to have Native American imagery. There's 19 U.S. military helicopters that are named after Native Americans. There's only one that isn't, and that's the Cobra. Um, for people my age or people who remember the TV show MASH, that HC-13 helicopter was the Sioux helicopter. The newest one that they have that's their training helicopter is the Lakota. So in that vein, then, and you know the Tomahawk missile, those kinds of things. So it's still that is not a policy anymore, but it is a tradition, and they don't steer away from that. So how do you think we address that? Is that still seen as harmful, and how do we address it?
Yeah, I mean that's a good. I wish I had the answer to that question. I would I wouldn't have any money, but I would have an answer to the question. But, yeah, I think it's just like it's a really difficult thing to kind of think about a lot of these things because again, people are attached to them too. And then when you think about the military in particular, like Native people, that's what a lot of my research is on, right? Native people have served in per capita the highest rates of like any race or ethnicity, right? And so I think it's like really challenging when you have these things, especially when you have the military, which is like built on tradition, right? That is like a huge part of that. And so I don't know if I like have the answer to that, but I think for me the biggest thing is just like education, right? I think as Megan was saying, kind of to riff off the like literature thing, right? I think like 5 to 10 years ago, like I could go through like a bookstore and not see any native authors, or if I were to see an author, it would maybe be Sherman Alexie, right? Who's kind of also
Yep.
come out as very problematic as well too. But like really, if you went to any bookstore in the United States, you're probably getting Sherman Alexie and maybe a couple other books. And some of the authors who you might have been seeing were maybe had like interesting like or no claims to tribal heritage. And so I think that's what's been cool just to see this explosion in the last 10 years of like native authors. Now I can go into any bookstore and I guarantee you when they have the front book at there, there's going to be at least 2 or 3 native authors, right? And they're writing about really interesting topics. There was a moment when a lot of those like kind of 4 or 5 really popular native authors were really kind of having to kind of write these like certain like westerns or certain ways,
Yeah.
but now they're able to kind of write about being like an urban native person in like Denver or Oakland or like all of these other places. And so it's been really cool to see just like all sorts of things like that. There's tons of films. I mean, we just saw like the Lakota versus United States film
Mm.
just won an Emmy last year, like for a documentary piece on it. So I think like if you start educating and sharing all these things, and I think that's a result of a lot of those things being eliminated. It's a result of a lot of those stereotypes and like mascots and all these things being removed, but you can't just remove them. You have to fill them with like other things, right? And so I think that's been the really cool thing in the last 2 years is like the growth and recognition of like how much stuff is like being pushed out there too. There's obviously a ton more room to grow for like all communities, right? But at the same time, I think it's just really exciting to kind of see the direction we're going with a lot of things too. And I think naturally some of those things are slowly kind of going away. And so I think that's like the hope is to kind of keep if they slowly go away, but also keep filling it with like really more better positive representation too.
Thank you for that. So I want to take a little break here. We've been chit-chatting here for a little bit. I want to open it up for anybody who has any questions, comments, anything anybody want to contribute to the conversation. If you don't feel like comfortable speaking up, go ahead and put it in the chat and we can address that there. Donna's in chat says that they remember Pharrell Williams stating that he had Native ancestry after that, but I never heard him going to any tribal nations and talking or contributing to those communities. He liked his music at that time too. And I think there was something I recall seeing with what Kanye West wore an Indian chief on his T-shirt or something, and it caused a lot of angst and concern too, as well it should. So, and if we don't have any questions or comments, I'm going to move along because I want to get to the piece about why. Oh, we have one. Chad says, thoughts on Europeans hosting their own wachipis or powwows? Do either of you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with it. And I know Chad as well too. So hi, Chad. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to see a lot of that because it is like a lot of cultural appropriation. And I think the reason I laughed was because I've seen some of those like on video, and it's kind of like such a ridiculous like interpretation of what they think a powwow or a wachipi in South Dakota would look like that it's almost like humorous because it looks nothing like any of the like beautiful culture and language and like songs that we do in the United States. And it's really interesting because on some level there's like a lot of times they say flattery like copying someone is kind of like a really nice thing to do, but it's also like this interesting way that the way that they're doing it is just like it's almost like a completely different thing. And so I think that's it's just really interesting. And I understand like people wanting there's like a big difference between like appropriation and like respectful, like I guess kind of I don't know the word I'm looking for on that, but I think yeah, there's like a really interesting conversation about that as well too.
Does it feel in some sort of way like almost like a mockery? Does it border on that kind of mentality?
I think so. Yeah. I think in some ways, I won't name the individual, but there's an organization that does language revitalization in the state of South Dakota and North Dakota. And that individual like got started doing language revitalization by like doing a lot of those kind of like powwows and like getting like an Indian name through all these like fake ceremonies that they're doing in Germany. But then he came over here and he's done a lot of harm to our communities in the state of South Dakota, right? But has a credibility because he has a PhD in linguistics. And so it's interesting like to see like kind of what like appropriation and like looks like for a lot of people and can cause a lot of harm to native communities like and so I think that's like yeah, I mean, there's like a lot of like fear for that of like it is almost like mockery in some ways, and I don't know if it's intended to be that way, but
Mm.
it's just yeah, it opens up a lot of doors for a lot of different things. I don't know if Megan has anything to add.
I think it connects because I want to acknowledge Donis because I love Donis so much. And what Donis said about Pharrell and her and I remembering that whole situation, like I think one of the things that's most harmful about these situations is that there's no responsibility or reciprocity. Like Pharrell can just so easily say, like, oh, I have a connection to I have native ancestry, therefore this is okay, right? It's almost like even in these people that sort of appropriate and take our stuff all of us that identify with a tribal community or identify with a group of people, we feel responsibility because there's reciprocity. If we claim a community, that community has to claim us back, right? There's this sort of give and take piece, and I think that the harm in those spaces is taking our things, but not feeling any reciprocity and not feeling any responsibility to a community of people. And so I think that applies across like pop culture, that applies across fashion, that applies across people being passionate about our ceremonies enough that they'll like, those things always make me laugh too, because we're like land-centered people and we're space-centered people. And so to like even take some of those ceremonies and put them away from the land where they originated, like where our creation stories come from, like where our communities are from, it also makes me laugh because there's no reciprocity to land or care of community or sustainability or community. So I think there's so many different things that are like sort of layered into that. I keep thinking they hate us because they ain't us. That's just what I keep thinking, all the things we're talking about. And it's true. Like that's, there's sort of this funny like feeling of, well, I'm glad that you want that, but you can't have it. Like, yeah, I'm sorry, but you like can't have it. So yeah, that's that. They hate us because they ain't us. Donis, I will make a shirt that says that.
So I want to turn the page a little bit to make this a little bit into a broader conversation. So those of us in the audience can benefit from your scholarly expertise and your experience. What are some of the harmful effects of these mascot stereotypes, cultural appropriation? Tell us, why is it so harmful? Because I know there's scholarly research on it. It's not just an opinion. I mean, there's research there.
Yeah, so I mean, when you're looking at like an academic point, there's research done by Stephanie Waterman that essentially she analyzed and looked at, I don't remember what grade, like if it's like elementary school students, and essentially had like a bunch of elementary school students who are non-native looked at like native mascots and Pocahontas and stereotypes and all these things, and their like self-confidence actually like went up. But when you show it to like native communities or native elementary students, their self-confidence actually goes down because they don't look like a lot of those images, right? Or they don't maybe like are related to those things or whatever. And so it actually does have like physical impacts on like native communities and students because there's like this perception that they're not like native enough, right? And so that's like a huge impact for things we do. But I also think for like the work that we do, we're working with like hundreds of students at the University of South Dakota, but also like throughout the state for different programs and different things. It makes it really difficult for students to be able to go into a room and just like be a person, right? Because like people have these stereotypes and perceptions about who Native people should or shouldn't be too. And so if they're learning stereotypes or like really inaccurate things about Native people too, they don't want to see Native people in the present sometimes, if that makes sense. And so I think it makes it really difficult for students to like come from tribal communities to like a space like Vermilion or Brookings or wherever they're going to college, and just like be like a human being in those spaces, like a college student going to like pursue like education. And so I think there's a lot of challenges that we see because of that, because of what people think Native people should be based on what they've grown up with.
I think a lot about the two men in John Kent's film, right, who were able to flip their own concepts of why these things are harmful based on their own lived experiences, right? And based on their own identity connections, they were able to have and it's not always that we need to be like empathy, right? Is sort of the framework root of the word about like, well, what if, and a lot of times, unfortunately, that's the way stereotypes, like that's the way people are able to confront stereotypes. Well, what if we had a stereotype about a community that you're a part of, right? How would that make you feel? A lot of times people are able to sort of framework that back to themselves. There's a really powerful scene in, I think it's Real Engine, where the research that John is talking about, they interviewed these little kids and had the shirt on, and their sense of self was reduced. And in the film, they're like showing these little kids watching these Westerns. And it's always been like very seared in my mind, that scene, because um, it's that subconscious that John was talking about, that you just don't even realize that it's affecting you until you are sitting in front of someone and they have that. It's the way that any of us feel when we see someone that has continued to wear the Washington mascot, even though we see those people out in public, like they continue to have Chief Wahoo on their shirt, like so staunchly determined that like this is who they are, and this is a part of their culture as a sports fan or as a sports fanatic. Again, like we work with the next generation of leaders. And like John said, many of them are in classrooms where they're the only Native student that's a part of it. And I think that like it's I think that sometimes it's so frustrating because we've been able to move past these stereotypical images for so many other communities of people. Like, why do we continue to be the ones that are left out, right, or left behind, or continue to have to fight for our ability to be depicted as human beings? And I think that even like the exhibit that you were talking about and seeing all of those things at once, I wish more people could see that and see how harmful that because we're used to it. Like I remember going into the grocery store and seeing that Land O'Lakes butter maiden or whatever the heck they called her. Like I remember that as a little kid, and I think that those continuing to like empower those types of exhibits and be able to have people sort of confront their own consciousness of how present and prevalent these things have been is really important, especially for the next generation of students and people that want to lead.
Absolutely. And I remember this, I'm much older than you guys are, but I remember when I was very small, I remember seeing the Mazola corn oil commercial with this beautiful Native American woman. And I was like, that's the corn oil everybody should use. You know, I mean, it was just bizarre, but I remember it. I was really young, and I remember that. And I think too, another a part of it that I think as a non-Indigenous person, I think about the viewpoint that it not only harms the Indigenous population, it harms us because we don't get an accurate view of what Native American people really and truly are with all these mascots and all this other business going on. But then I also think about back to when we were talking about stereotypes and what you mentioned, John, about the alcoholism and stuff like that. With those stereotypes in place, that really limits opportunities. When people will have a preordained opinion of oh they're Native, they probably drink a lot, or it's a hateful thing to say, but there are people out there that have those opinions. They're whether it be they're not gonna they're gonna the phraseology of they're going to be on Indian time. I wonder if they're going to get to work on time. It's just nobody wants to admit that that's the way they think, but it's out there. And so, whatever we need to do to replace these stereotypes and thought processes, I think is what we need to do. And I think about too with the MMIP and particular MMIW issue, missing and murdered Indigenous women, the objectification of Native women has just perpetuated that issue. And even with Native American men, the cover of the romance novel, and Native American women is the Indian princess. Not in Pocahontas or not, yeah, Pocahontas is not a Disney character. These types of portrayals and stuff are actually very harmful in that regard. So what I'm coming to here is how do we then change the narrative? We need to change the master narrative. We have to figure out a way to do that. And I think again to another one of Phil Deloria's books, Indians in Unexpected Places, where if you get a chance to read it, it's fantastic for those of you in the audience because he talks about we need to bring forward these stories about people like you said at the very beginning, Megan. Let's tell the stories now. What's the real deal? So how do we do that? How do we change this narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is just to reflect on kind of the things coming out and encourage folks to like engage with that stuff too. So I can't for everyone in here. I think a few of the folks I know have watched it for sure, but like the TV show Reservation Dogs that
Oh,
came out, I mean, it won a ton of awards. And that show did some like really, really simple things. Like one of the things was like they had an all native room of like writers, right? Which is like probably the first and only time in history. Now it's not, right? Now it's the norm, right? Now people know if they're writing about native people, they have to have native people in the room, right? And so and there was a show on there was an episode of another show where they like made fun of a bunch of like the current shows and like roasted those shows so much that there were like rumors that those shows didn't get awards because people were afraid to like award them, right? And so I think that's the important part is just like putting native people in these spaces to be able to like write about that and to change that. That's going to change it naturally, right? And so I think that even just getting like a show like Reservation Dogs is now having spin-offs. It's like a lot of the people that started on that are now starting on their own shows, and so I think it's like a small little ripple effect that's like making a huge impact. And then for me, I think the Megan brought like Ian Washburn up, and who was one of the individuals that was we featured in the film too, right? You also have to have like a lot of patience for folks to kind of like undo a lot of these things, right? Like Ian, you're seeing like a very small part of Ian in the film, about 5 minutes, and so you don't get to hear, like, I got to have a lot of conversations with Ian, but I also got to meet the Native person that went to high school with Ian. When I was doing one of the film screenings, he like showed up to it, and he was telling me even more about like Ian's journey. He's like, I was telling that Joker in like when he was 16 years old that like the Redskins was racist and like we shouldn't be saying it, we shouldn't be like using it, like, and he wouldn't listen to me. And so it was really interesting. Like 20 years later, he's like, then 20 years later, he's like in a film, like, and I told him that 20 years ago, he could have learned, and so it's like interesting, like that was a 15-year journey, like, and he can define like specific moments. Like he can remember in 1992 when Suzanne Harjo, like, he kind of went to the protest. He remembers walking to the Super Bowl and seeing them protest and being like, oh, that's interesting that there's like Native people doing it. He can remember like in 1996, the lawsuit. He can remember in like 2000, like he can remember all these like specific moments. And it wasn't until like 2006 when he saw a photo of himself like with his nephew and was like, oh, like I'm teaching this to like my nephew. And it just, but again, it took 15 to like 20 years for him to like it to click finally. And some people are going to come faster than that, and some people are never going to get it right. But it's like at the same time, you have to give someone like Ian enough time and patience to be able to do that. And it's frustrating, right? It's frustrating that like when he's telling me that story, and I'm like, bro, like how, like you had this 16-year-old Native dude telling you that too. Like, why didn't you just listen to him? So it's like hard because you have to like have some people have to have patience to kind of figure it out. And so I think that's a lot of like patience is like one thing I've learned a lot with it too, and not being angry at folks for not knowing, because it's not necessarily their fault. It's our education system, it's our like Hollywood, it's all these things that are like being projected at them as well too. But yeah, Megan, did you have anything to add?
I just have to say, I always laugh at the alcoholism stereotype because I'm like, go to any small town in South Dakota and look at how many non-native people have an alcohol problem. So I just had to say that. But I think that sort of from, the extension of and those were systems that were placed upon our communities, right? That contribute to those issues, right, happening, is that those are systems that settler colonialism did to us, right? So a lot of times I want to challenge people to look back on their own histories and their own historical frameworks to say, actually, you probably contributed to those ideas and those issues. I think, one of the things that I just wanted to mention about, and it's stereotype threat, that for those of us and many of us, who are on the call, who are Native and work in predominantly white spaces, it means that for those of us that are in particular positions, we have to be perfect, right? We have to be perfect because there is this stereotype threat of like the belief that there are certain factors or identities or pieces of who we are that are less than, right? And so we can't mess up. We can't be late. We have to answer all of the stupid questions that we get about Native people, which many of us have gotten over the years of our work, right? Many ridiculous questions about Native people. When there's so many books that are written about Native people, there's so many phenomenal programs like this that are happening. There's so many amazing people that podcasts, Instagram posts, influencers, like it's just about pushing the general public to put Native people on their roster, right? Like don't just listen to stories that are produced by people that you're comfortable with, like invest in Native people, buy Native products, care about Native issues, like all of those things are out there and they're amazing people doing amazing work. I think for me and a lot of what John has like talked about and like pushing back on these narratives is investing in the next generation because they're going to be able to go into these spaces and like I said, like be in all of these incredible positions to make change. And the more that for us, right, in the work that we do, invest in scholarships, invest in higher education, help Native students to and through college, like that's the answer because, tomorrow we're graduating 30 phenomenal graduates who are all going into different things and doing different things. Right before this call, we were going through the list of what their plans are next. And the more that we just continue to like invest in Native people and success and move away from this deficit model, like we're amazing. Like our students are amazing. Like we're doing amazing things. We deserve recognition for the things that are coming for us, right? So I think again, it continues to be pervasive. We have to do the work, but let's just prove them wrong. Like let's just continue to excel and continue to succeed in spaces that like were not built or were not created for us. That's how we fix the problem, right? Prove them wrong. And that's what we tell students all the time. You can do it. You deserve to be here. You were put in systems that weren't fair, but it's not your fault. Like you have every tool to be able to succeed and rise and be amazing because they are.
And that is the exact thing I was hoping to end on, is that kind of statement, because we all have a role to play in this. All of us, every single one of us. And we can, working together, we can turn it around. And it needs to change, obviously. We are out of time. Everybody's lunch break is over. So I do want to thank everybody for joining us today. John, Megan, thank you so much. I appreciate you so much. Congratulations again, Megan. Knock 'em dead. I hope you all join us again in a couple weeks. We're going to talk about the South Dakota teacher shortage and what efforts are being made to inspire teachers to stick around here in South Dakota and go into the field of education. I hope you'll join us again in a couple of weeks. Enjoy the wonderful warm weather if you're here in South Dakota, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.